Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Cecilia, for inviting me. So very quickly today, we're going to cover how to secure your Azure SQL databases with PrivateLink. Before I go ahead and jump into the actual topic, let me quickly introduce myself. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Urrutia. I am a senior cloud architect at Microsoft. Originally from Bogota, from Colombia, I live in Miami, and went to the University of Florida. So if there's any Gators over there, go Gators. And I'm currently a master's student of data science at the Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech. Some of my hobbies, I like to play tennis, like to travel when we were able to travel before, and enjoy a good beer, a good IPA. And of course, technology. Mostly my base today is in Azure, in the Azure and Microsoft world. But I also have experience with some of the other cloud services. Some of the certifications that I've had in the past is the AWS certification. So if anybody has any questions around AWS and Azure and how to do translation between the two cloud providers, please write your questions in the Q&A, and we can certainly go through those. I think, Cecilia, you're going to be monitoring the Q&A section of
Yes, correct.
the event. Okay, perfect. And on the bottom right, you can see my LinkedIn. If you're going to connect with me, just send me a connect request and we can definitely connect in LinkedIn. This is some of the companies that I've worked for or in projects that I've worked at those companies in my current role as a cloud architect with Microsoft. Of course, living here in Miami, the cruise lines, worked with the cruise lines over the last couple of months, the Spirit Airlines, Ultimate Software, all these local companies here in the area. And other companies, more global companies around the country and around the world. That's enough about me. So let's talk about the agenda for today. So I'm going to make the assumption that some of the people here are new to the cloud or are still getting into this whole cloud world. So I'm going to cover some of the cloud fundamentals, go over what's IaaS versus PaaS, make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of that. Then go a little bit more deeper into IaaS. Where do those services live when we say we deploy something as an IaaS? What is PaaS? What are the advantages and disadvantages of platform as a service or PaaS? Then I'm going to cover some of the Azure SQL specific service, or what's Azure SQL, and then the PrivateLink. We're going to go over an overview of those two services, and then I'll show you guys an architectural diagram of what we're going to be deploying in the portal, in the Azure portal today. My plan is I want to keep it, I don't want to go too much over the slides. I have a couple of slides, but I'm going to try to go fast over those and quickly jump to the portal where we can actually be deploying stuff and be learning as we're deploying all these services in the Azure portal. Okay. So let's start with the different cloud service models. And this is usually a slide that I like to go over quickly as when we get into this cloud world, people start asking questions or start hearing things like IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, and what does that mean, right? So when we go into the cloud, traditionally, if you look at your data centers today, your services, your applications in your on-prem data centers, you are responsible, you manage all these layers within your data center, right? So you got to manage networking, you got to manage your storage, your servers, if you have any virtualization, like Hyper-V or VMware, something like that. And then the guest operating system, all these different layers are managed by you as the customer, right? As you move into the cloud, the first step that we usually see customers taking is going into what we call an infrastructure as a service model. In this model, the vendor, in this case, it could be Microsoft, in my case, Azure, or AWS or Google Cloud, depending on the cloud provider that you have. They're going to manage some of these layers for you. So they're going to manage the networking. You don't have to worry about setting up the networking of the data center or setting up, racking up servers. None of that is something that you would have to worry about. In this infrastructure as a service model, you manage the guest operating system. It could be a Windows VM or it could be a Linux VM, and everything on top of that operating system. Any middleware that you need to run, any applications, you are responsible only for the guest operating system. Everything below that is the responsibility of the cloud provider. Okay. If we keep moving to the right, then we jump into what we call the platform as a service model. And in this case, more layers are managed by the provider. And then your responsibility is more around the data and the applications themselves. You can switch your focus, instead of having to manage VMs and servers and operating system and patching your different VMs. You don't have to worry about that anymore. You can focus on your business problem, on the application that you're developing, and forget about having to manage that underlying infrastructure. So that is the big benefit of platform as a service. And again, all the different cloud providers have different services that fall under this category. In the case of Azure, and what we're going to look at today is Azure SQL, for example, is an example of a platform as a service offering where we give you a database in the cloud. You don't have to worry about where that database is hosted, in which server, what operating system is below that database. None of that you don't have to worry about that because all of that is managed by us, the cloud provider. And finally, software as a service is the last traditional cloud service model. And in this case, the provider will give you a software. You don't have to worry about where that software is hosted. Typical example is Office 365 or Salesforce, where you can use the applications. You only worry about your data, but everything else underneath that application is completely managed by the provider. You don't have to worry about any of that. Okay, so these are the different cloud service models that we see, and the goal, the goal is always to move towards the right side of the screen as much as possible, right? So what we call here the cloud migration journey is when I'm working with a customer that is starting to get into the cloud, the first step for that customer is to move, is to pretty much rehost what they already had on-prem. They just take those VMs and they just move those to the cloud, right? In this case, let's say to Azure. Once they're in the cloud, then we start working with them on how can we refactor and re-architect some of the components of those applications to try to leverage some of the PaaS services of the cloud as much as possible. Again, the benefit in this case is the customer can focus more on the business problem, and they don't have to spend too much resources on having to maintain, manage, and operate the underlying infrastructure. So the goal, as I said, in the cloud is always try to go as far right as possible. Once you're in this side of the chart, then you're still probably gonna have to consume some of the IaaS services, but then you're gonna have more PaaS services and be able to leverage more the benefits of your application being in the cloud. That's where innovation starts to happen. So when we talk about infrastructure as a service, some of the fundamentals, and just to make it easy for everybody to understand, you can think of IaaS is pretty much a VM in the cloud, right? So it's a managed compute service that we give you in the cloud, and you still have full control of the guest operating system of that VM. So you still manage, let's say if it's a Windows VM, you still have, you have your Windows VM, you can patch it, you have to patch it and update it. We're not going to do that for you. You still have to, install your applications. So pretty much you have a VM that you used to have on-prem now live in the cloud. And that's what infrastructure as a service, is in the cloud. Now, when you deploy this VM, in the case of Azure, it's deployed in what we call a virtual network. So it's your own address space in the cloud. It's a private IP space. And I don't want to go too deep into a networking conversation because I know this is more of a SQL type conversation. But it's basically going to give you your own address space in the cloud, and is private only for your company. You can choose the address space. You can choose how you connect your, let's say, on-prem data center to Azure. So that's what a virtual network is going to give you in Azure. And again, a VM is deployed in a virtual network. Now, VMs is not the only things that you can deploy on a VNet. You can deploy all sorts of things, including load balancers, the VPN gateways, and PaaS services, which is what we're going to discuss today. So through PrivateLink, you're going to be able to deploy some of these PaaS services within a virtual network. And it's going to give you that boundary, that security, that an organization sometimes requires of these services being deployed within a private virtual network. Now, comparing that with platform as a service, as I mentioned earlier, a PaaS service, it allows you to develop your applications and your services without having to maintain servers or the underlying infrastructure. So what are the advantages of this? You can focus on the business solution. You don't have to maintain infrastructure. I've mentioned this a couple of times. And of course, that's going to help you cut some of the coding time. So some of the time that you spend having to rack up servers and implement, deploy your operating system and any middleware that you need, you don't have to worry about that anymore. You can develop this application faster and put them out in the market a lot more faster than before, right? And then it gives you access to some sophisticated tools that you didn't have access before or that were very expensive to run. So if you think, for example, a machine learning, an application that leverages machine learning or AI, having to deploy that on-prem before may require many servers to be able to run some of these machine learning algorithms. So now in the cloud, if we give you that option, that service as a platform as a service that your application can consume, then is one of the big benefits of using PaaS, right, over IaaS. The disadvantages, or one of the big disadvantages of PaaS, I guess, at least from a security perspective, is that most PaaS services, and I say most, not all, but most PaaS services are not deployed within your own virtual network or within your own VNet. So they have a public endpoint and they're exposed publicly. So there is ways to limit who can connect to your PaaS service. And if you look in this diagram in the right, for example, Azure SQL being the PaaS service and a VM in a virtual network being the what we call IaaS. When this VM, even though everything is in Azure, both the VM and the SQL are both in Azure, when this VM needs to talk to the Azure SQL, it's going to go through the internet and connect to a public IP address that the Azure SQL database has. Okay? If you have something on premises that needs to talk to this database, same thing. It's going to go through the internet and then to the public endpoint of that Azure SQL. So there are ways to limit who can connect to Azure SQL, but many customers or organizations have certain restrictions. It can be regulations or simply their security IT department does not allow this type of setup to happen, and they want to be able to have the SQL database inside of it. And that's what a private link is going to give you. It's going to give you the possibility of have these PaaS services that traditionally have public endpoints. We're going to be able to put them inside a VNet or have a connection, have a private endpoint within the VNet that can talk to that PaaS service. Now, going a little bit into the Azure world now, high level, for those of you that are new into Azure, we have the concept of a region, which is basically a data center or a group of data centers in a particular location in the world. So it's when and we're going to jump into the portal soon, when we deploy any services in Azure, one of the first things that we're going to get asked through the process is, where do you want to deploy this service? In what region? So that's what a region is pretty much a group of data centers in a particular location in the world. We have 54 of those regions. And ideally, you may want to select a region that is close to either your users or close to, where your company, let's say, is located. There is a list of not all, but many of the Azure services, and this list keeps growing and keeps changing. But just to give you an idea, what I want to get out of this slide is you can see up here, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. So some of the IaaS services that I discussed, the VM on the left side, storage, any VM is going to have a disk storage, and then the virtual network. And there's a bunch of other, what we call, are considered IaaS services, right? And then on top of that, we have the platform as a service offering. And you see there's a bunch of those. So just on the data space, you can have an Azure SQL database, you can have a MySQL database if you are more into the open source world. You can have a Cosmos DB if you want to deploy an application with a NoSQL backend. Data Factory allows you to move data from one location to another, doing transformations. So there is a bunch of different data services available in Azure. And also, there's PaaS for other categories. So IoT, I've worked in a couple of projects where, customer wants to connect IoT devices to the cloud. And they can deploy something like an IoT hub, where they allows them to connect all these devices and bring the data into one single place. So there's all these different PaaS services. Today, we're going to focus on the SQL database, but I wanted to show you the list of all the different Azure services that are available.
We have one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Azure VNet to Azure PaaS SQL go over the internet. Is there an allow Azure services flag that allows Azure to Azure access?
So that is correct, and we're actually going to see that today. So that's going to allow only Azure services to talk to the database, to Azure SQL. But again, it's a flag, and we're going to see it, and basically allows anything within that has an Azure public IP address to be able to talk to this Azure PaaS resource, in this case, the Azure SQL. But if you want to control further who can talk to your database, that's where PrivateLink is going to come along and be able to just control, I only want this particular VNet or, this particular set of networks to talk to my Azure SQL database. But we're going to see that in a minute. So very high level about Azure SQL. It's basically, like I said, a database in the cloud. There's multiple types of SQL offerings that we have in Azure. But all the way to the left, we have the traditional SQL server on a VM. In this case, it's nothing different than what you would do on-prem. You deploy a virtual machine with Windows Server, and then on top of that, you deploy the SQL Server software, right? Some customers, if they need full control of the VM and they need to put maybe some modifications to the operating system, to the registry, they may want this, and this is usually the first step as a customer moving to the cloud, is they just take the VM that they had on-prem, move it to the cloud, and they install SQL Server, move their databases, all that stuff. But there is nothing different here than what you're already doing on-prem. It's just that instead of being on your data center, it's now on Azure. And now all the way to the right, we have the concept of an Azure SQL database. And in this case, again, it's a platform as a service offering. And what's going to give you is a fully managed database in the cloud. You don't have to worry about VMs. You don't have to worry about patching, operating system, none of that. You only worry about building your data models, building your data architecture, creating your tables, all the different things that you would do within SQL without having to worry about the operating system or maintaining any underlying infrastructure. So this is what we're going to deploy today. It's an Azure SQL database. So I wanted to make sure that you guys understood the difference between the different offerings of SQL and Azure. All the way to the left, you can traditionally deploy a SQL Server with a VM with SQL Server. All the way to the right is a fully managed Azure SQL database. There is Azure SQL Managed Instance is somewhere in the middle between those two, but I'm not going to go into the details. For now, Azure SQL Database we're going to deploy today.
One more question.
Yes.
Can Active Directory be used to control access to services and data?
You can use Azure AD as the authentication mechanism for SQL. You can do that, but it cannot control the connectivity piece. So, for example, you might want to restrict, again, what networks can connect to Azure SQL, right? You don't want to have that open to the world. You may want to restrict to potentially only, let's say, a set of VMs in your VNet can talk to that SQL, and you want to restrict that. So that's what we're going to do with PrivateLink. Once you connect to the database and you're able to talk to the database, and you need to authenticate. And in that case, you would use Azure Active Directory to authenticate into the database.
Good.
Okay. All right, finally, I think this is the last slide and we're gonna move into the portal is PrivateLink. So this is what I was mentioning earlier. What PrivateLink is gonna give you is the ability to configure the PaaS service, in this case SQL, but it could be many of the other PaaS services, right? It doesn't have to be just SQL. It's gonna create a private endpoint within your VNet. So if you look at this diagram right here, we have a bunch of VMs, and then a private endpoint was created with a private IP address, and that endpoint points to the SQL database or to the PaaS service that lives outside of the virtual network. So now when this VM wants to talk to the SQL server, it doesn't go through the internet anymore or to a public endpoint. It just talks to this private IP address. And now you can restrict that traffic that comes only from the VNet to this private endpoint. You can also, let's say, for example, if you have still have some applications on premises that need to talk to a SQL database, again, instead of going around or going through the internet to connect to the public endpoint of the SQL database, you can connect through your own premises through to Azure. Most customers that I work with already have a connectivity between on-premises and Azure, so they connect to either a VPN or through ExpressRoute. We provide a private link between Azure and your on-premises services, so they connect through that and talk to a private endpoint, and then from there to the SQL database. And everything, like you said, stays within this, or at least the connectivity is within the VNet. You got an IP address, a private IP address is created inside the VNet to be able to talk to a SQL database. And like I said, it's not only for SQL. So I'm going to make the demo today is going to be around SQL, but you can do this for storage accounts, for Cosmos DBs, for data lakes. So any service that has a public endpoint, or most services that have public endpoints in Azure, they can be protected using this private endpoint or private link. Okay, so with that, let's jump into demo time. And this is what we're going to deploy today. High level, the architecture is going to be very simple. So we're going to deploy an Azure SQL database. So you'll see how to deploy this in Azure. And then we're going to deploy a virtual network with a VM. And then we're going to attempt to connect. We're going to play a little bit with this, connect from the VM into the SQL database, and before creating the private endpoint, and then after creating the private endpoint, so you guys can see how that works. Okay. At the end, the way it should work is that there will be no connectivity from the internet. So this is me sitting right here with my laptop. If I try to connect to the SQL database, at the end, this should not work. It's going to be blocked, because I'm only going to allow connectivity to this private endpoint, and only this VM or VMs within this VNet will be able to talk to this Azure SQL database. Okay, so these are the steps again. We're going to create the Azure SQL database. We're going to create a VNet, create a VM, and then the private endpoint. So I'm going to go into the portal and start deploying this. Okay, so let me come here If you're not familiar with the Azure portal, let me go into the actual link. So if you go to portal.azure.com, that's where there's a portal for Azure, and that's where we start deploying stuff. There's many ways to navigate the portal. One thing that if we look back into this architecture, outside this dotted line right here is what we call a resource group. And one thing about Azure is that whatever we deploy in Azure lives within a resource group. And that's basically a resource group is basically a container of resources. Anytime you're going to deploy anything in Azure, it's going to ask you in what resource group you want to put this on. So that's going to be the first step before we even try to deploy anything. We have to first create a resource group, and that's what I'm going to do. So from up here, I can search for resource groups. We're going to click and add, and we're going to create a new resource group. And again, the purpose of a resource group is nothing else than just grouping resources. So in general, you want to create a resource group, for example, for your application. If your application has a web front end, a backend that is a database for the backend, you may have, let's say, for example, the virtual network. So all of those things, you may want to group them into one resource group, this container of resources that have the same life cycle. I'm going to call this Magna data RG, just so I know what this resource group is for. And the concept of the region that I mentioned earlier is where do you want to deploy this? I'm going to select East US is the closest region to me. But if I expand this, you'll see all the different regions that we have available for you to deploy resources. And again, the best practice here is to try to deploy resources in a region that is close to your company, to where your company is located, or to where your users are going to be accessing these services from. In my case, I'm going to select East US. Click next. If I want to tag resources, any resource that we deploy in Azure, we can add tags to it, metadata. In this case, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to click and review and create, Resource group created. We're going to go into the resource group, and we'll see that so far we have nothing, no resources in this resource group. This is empty. What we've done so far is we created this container of resources, and now we're going to start deploying. Actually, now that I think about it, this is wrong. This resource group should also include the SQL PaaS. The SQL database is going to be inside the resource group as well. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to deploy is the Azure SQL database. So let's go back into the portal. We're going to click Add. We're inside the resource group that I just created. And like I said, there's many ways to navigate the portal and to create resources. I'm going to create from here this time around, but you can also come here and click on create a resource and search the resource from here. So there's multiple ways of doing the same thing in Azure. I'm going to click here, add. And it's going to ask me, what do you want to deploy? I'm going to say Azure SQL. I'm going to search for that. Okay. So we have all the different options. I'm going to select Azure SQL here. Click create. And then it's going to ask me what type of SQL do I want. As I mentioned earlier, there's different offerings. You can deploy a SQL on a VM. This would be more of an infrastructure as a service offering where you have to manage the VM. But in this case, what I want to do is set up a SQL database. I don't want to worry about VMs or none of that. So I'm going to select this option right here. I want a single database. So I'll click create. So the first thing it's going to ask is my resource group. It's already selected Magna Data RG since I started this process from inside the resource group. but I can deploy this in a different resource group if I wanted to. I'm going to deploy everything inside the same resource group. And then a database name, I'll use Magna Data DB, and a server. So you can have multiple databases on a server. Now, this is going to be a server that is abstracted from you. You're not going to see it. You're not going to see a VM. This server is, again, is managed by us. You have no control over this server. So I still have to create it. So I'm going to click create new. And I'm going to name this Magna Data DB server. Log in here, and a password. And the location, again, I'm selecting East US, but you can select any region that is convenient to you. I'm going to leave everything else as default. Click next. I'm not going to make any changes to the networking. We're going to configure this later on. Click next. Again, no changes to this. I'm actually going to disable this data security. Not going to do any changes here. Next. As I mentioned earlier, you can tag resources. Let's say, for example, I want to add a tag here called environment. A dev environment. But this is for you to use as metadata for this resource. Click next, and then create the resource. So you can see right here, Azure has this notification button where you can see what's happening in the environment. So right now it's saying that deployment is in progress. We're deploying the SQL database. So it's gonna take a couple of minutes for the database to deploy. So while that's being deployed, if we go back into our diagram right here, we see that we're deploying this Azure SQL, and then the next step is to create a virtual network, right? So what we're gonna do next is to create the virtual network, and the VNet, virtual network VNet, is where we deploy then later on the virtual machine and the private endpoint for this SQL database. Okay, I'm gonna go back into the portal and deploy that. So from the portal, we're gonna search for virtual networks. I already have a bunch of different VNets here. I'm gonna create a new one. And as I mentioned before, first thing, resource group. You're always going to be asked for this. I'm going to select the resource group that I created, Magna Data RG. And then the name for this VNet, I'm just going to call it Magna Data VNet. Location, I'm going to leave default as East US. Click next. And by the way, I think the database is already finished. I got the notification here. So you see deployment succeeded. The database is already deployed. So we're going to go back into the configuration of that in a minute. Let me finish deploying the virtual network here. For IP space, I can select any IP space that I want. In the case of, let's say, if you're working within your company in a project, it's something that you may need to work with your cloud architecture team, your network architecture team, to make sure that you use an Azure space that is not being used anywhere else in the company. In my case, I'm going to go with 10.22.0.0/16. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of the networking here, but any for a VNet, you always need a subnet. I'm going to deploy this at a new subnet. Oh, that's the name, sorry. I'm going to call this Magna Data subnet. If you have some familiarity with networking, this should be very simple to you. Again, the address space, and then the subnet has to be within the address space that we define above. We're going to move into security. I'm going to leave everything disabled. I'm not going to deploy any of this. Again, in the tag section, if you want to add any tags, I'll do the same thing, environment, and select dev. But this is totally optional. Click next, and then create. Okay, so let's go back into the architecture. Let's see how we're doing here. We deploy this SQL database. We deploy this virtual network. And now we need to deploy, I'm going to deploy this virtual machine. That's going to be the next step. Okay. So again, back into the portal, you see the virtual network has already been deployed. That was very fast. I'm going to go into search for virtual machines. And the only reason I'm deploying this VM is to show you the connectivity. Let me go back here between this VM. So let's say you have the application in this VM that connects to SQL, or that you have, in this case, what I have is a VM that has SQL Management Studio installed. So I can, so from there I can connect to a SQL database. You don't need the VM at all for SQL. I'm just using this for testing purposes to show you and test the connectivity between the VM and SQL and the SQL database. But if you're working in your applications, and you may not need a VM at all, the database is completely separate. So from here, I'm going to click on add a VM. And very similar as the other resources that we just deployed, is a very similar form where it asks where you're going to deploy this, in what resource group. I'm going to select Magna Data RG. The name of the VM, I'm going to call this Magna Data. Being very creative today, but that's fine. The region is going to be East US, and then image is you select what, if you want to deploy a Windows VM, Linux VM. So there is some pre-built images available that you can use. In this case, I'm going to select an image that I had already created earlier that already has SQL Management Studio installed. So I'm going to select image, go into my items, and then select this image, Windows 10, that already has SSM SQL Studio Management Studio installed. That way I don't have to install it manually. I'm going to leave the default size for that VM. And then let's do, I need to enter the username and the password so I can connect to the VM. I'm going to leave everything else as default here. The license type, in my case, is Windows Client. I'm going to say that I have the license for this. I'm not going to make any changes to the disks. From a networking perspective, where do I want to deploy this VM? I selected, or already automatically selected for me, that Magna Data VNet that I created earlier. So yes, I want to deploy the VM in this VNet. And then everything else, I'm just going to leave it default. I'm not going to go into details around that. I am going to disable diagnostics. We're not going to do anything with that, and leave everything else default. Click next. Nothing here. Click next. I'm not going to add any tags here. Click next. And then click on create. Okay, so back to the architecture. This is complete. This is complete. We create the virtual network and just deploy the VM. So now the next step is we're going to connect into this virtual machine, and we're going to attempt to connect to this Azure SQL database. Okay. So while the VM is being deployed, let's go and check the SQL database that we created in the portal. So if we go back into the portal here and go to the search for Azure SQL, we should now have a SQL database created. this Magna Data DB. So if I go into the Magna Data DB, you'll see that the server name, and this is the endpoint that we can use to connect to the database. So that's the URL that we're going to use from the VM to connect to this database. There's a bunch of different configuration here for SQL database. The one that we care about, actually, let's click here. We're going to be working around this firewalls and VNets, this section right here. But for now, before we go into here, let's take the URL for the server. I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to paste this in a notepad. And let's wait for the VM to be deployed so we can attempt to connect from the VM into this database. Well, this is being deployed. Cecilia, any questions in the chat?
Yes, we have a question from Ray about the private endpoint.
Mhm.
Does each Azure SQL instance or Cosmos DB instance need its own private endpoint, or can they share one? What if they need to talk to each other?
So the answer is yes. Each one's going to have their own private endpoint. Each resource that you want to connect privately is going to have their own private endpoint. And then, so private endpoint is going to allow the connectivity. So let's go back in here. So private endpoint is going to allow connectivity to the actual resource. So from this VM to the resource itself. That's the private IP. If you had two SQL databases, for example, I guess, well, let's do something else, or trying to think, maybe a web application that is also a PaaS resource, we'll consider a PaaS, and that web application needs to talk to the Azure SQL, then that web application can also have a private endpoint created, and that web application, as long as is configured within the VNet, then that web application can use the private endpoint of the SQL server to talk to that SQL server. So it's a way that you can do that. But each resource is going to have that you want to connect with that you want to let me see, not deploy, because the resource is not deployed within the VNet, but the private endpoint for that resource is deployed within the VNet, and each resource is going to have their own private endpoint in that case. Not sure if I was able to answer your question there, but yes, the answer is yes. Each resource is going to have their own private IP endpoint.
Wonderful.
Okay, so this is still deploying. Refresh here and see if it finished. Sometimes it finishes in the background and it doesn't tell me. But I guess while this is deploying, let me send you guys, I want to post it in the presentation for private endpoint if you want to read more about it. But again, private endpoint is for incoming connection into the resource. If the resource itself needs to make an external call, it's not going to use that private IP address. It's only for incoming connectivity into the resource. Okay. All right, we finally finished deploying the VM. So now we're going to connect into the VM and then test connectivity to Azure SQL. So we're going to go into virtual machines. We should now see a Magna Data VM created. We're going to go inside the resource and we're going to connect to this resource. If I click on connect, I'm going to RDP. I'm going to download the RDP file and from here connect to the virtual machine. I use the same username and password that I used earlier when I created it. And this is just a regular Windows 10 VM. Nothing special about it. The only thing is that I configured or installed SQL Studio Management Studio. SQL Studio Management Server. I forgot what's SSMS, what it stands for. But that's the only thing that has different. This VM is that I installed that to save some time. Taking some time to log in. Any other questions, Cecilia, in the chat? Or
Oh, we're good.
Okay. This is the first time that I'm logging into Windows. It's taking some time, but okay, I finally loaded. So again, regular VM, nothing special about it. So what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to go open SQL Server Management Studio. What it stands for? Let's see, where is that? Let me see. Okay, there you go. Okay, and while that opens, let me open a command prompt here really quick. If we have any networking people in the audience, I'm going to do a quick test here. So if I do an NS lookup and enter the name of, well, that's not it. Where's my notepad? So this is the URL of the database that we just created, right? Go here and do an NS lookup and then the name or the URL for that server. So you'll see that we're getting this address. It's a public IP address. Well, actually, sorry, this address, public IP address for that server. So the communication is going to be able to talk to this server, it has to go through the internet, right? Just gonna open Management Studio and we're gonna now connect to that database. If I attempt to do the same thing actually from my laptop, this is not from the VM anymore. This is my laptop that is not in Azure. This is my home network. If I try to do the same thing, there you go. So you see, same thing. This is the public IP address of that server. It's going through the internet, and I'm able to talk to. I would be able to talk to the server because it's a public endpoint, right? And that's what we're going to try to solve. Should have put more CPUs into this VM, it seems. Okay, bear with me. It should take a couple more seconds, and then we'll do this testing. Okay. So you should be very familiar with this. The SQL Server Management Studio. I can enter the server name that I want to connect to. So I'm going to enter this URL that we get from Azure, and I'm going to use SQL Server Authentication. Somebody was asking earlier about Azure Active Directory, so you can see here that you can actually authenticate with Azure AD. In this case, I'm just going to use SQL Server Authentication. We'll see what happens if I attempt to connect. So the first thing it's saying is your client IP does not have access to the server. So That's because in the portal, we're not, so somebody was mentioning this earlier, was asking this question. If we go into the portal, go into the SQL resource that we created earlier, and go to firewalls and virtual networks, you see that right now this this option is select. We have this selected as no. Allow Azure services and resources to access this server. So I can select. I'm gonna click on yes here and save. But what you gotta keep in mind is by you doing this, you're basically allowing any Azure service, any service deployed in Azure, in any of the Azure networks, is gonna be able to talk to that server. Okay, so you're opening your database to a whole range of IPs, that we use in Azure, not just for your VNets, but any customer of Azure, in theory, would have connectivity to that Azure SQL database. They may not be able to authenticate because they don't have the username and password, but the connectivity would be there, right? So now we're going to attempt to connect again. What happened here? Okay. Now that we selected, that we allow that, and we should be able to connect now into the server, into the database. Again, you should be very familiar with this. Now we connect to the server. We can see the databases that we have inside the server. This is the database that we created, Magna DB. You can see any tables. We don't have any tables other than the system tables created. So again, very regular database that you could have on-prem. In this case, it's on the cloud in Azure, and you don't have to manage the server. You don't have to manage any of that. Okay. I'm going to disconnect again from the server. Just to prove that if we select this back to no and save, then we should not be able to connect again to the database. I'm going to connect again. Same URL. And we're going to get the same message saying our IP is not allowed to access this server. So and this is fine for many companies or many customers. They're fine with being able to restrict. So if we go back into the portal, you can enter the list of IPs that you want to allow into the server. You can turn this on, and then any Azure service will be able to talk to the database. So that is totally fine. Some customers are okay with that. They can leave the public endpoint running, and then just list, let's say, the IP addresses from on premises or from your other networks that you want to connect to. That's totally fine. But what private endpoint is going to give you is that private connectivity. And some customers, like I said, require because of regulations or because of their security constraints, they require this private connectivity, and they don't want a public endpoint for the database to be able to be allowed anymore, right? So that's going to be the last step in this demonstration. Is now we're going to deploy this private endpoint, and we're going to connect from the VM to Azure SQL using the private endpoint instead. So we deployed these three things already. We're going to go into this last one, creating the private endpoint. So let me go back into the portal, and we're going to deploy the private link or private endpoint. Is the same thing. So back into the portal, we're going to go to PrivateLink. Actually, we can do it from the SQL server instead. It's going to be easier. So let's go back into Azure SQL. We're going to go into the server. By the way, a SQL, an Azure SQL server can have multiple databases. If you go into databases, you'll see that right now we only have this Magna DB. But there's other offerings where you can have multiple DBs within the same SQL server. We're going to go into firewalls and virtual networks. Actually, no, private endpoint connections. and then click on create or this plus sign private endpoint. We're going to create it again, same resource group. So private endpoint itself is a resource. So it does need to live within a resource group. And we're going to call this Magna Data DB endpoint. I'm going to select the same region where I've been deploying everything in East US. Click next. Where do I want to, what's the resource that I want to create this endpoint for? So somebody was asking earlier if each resource needed their own private endpoint, and I said yes, and here's the reason why. When you create the private endpoint, it actually asks you what this private endpoint is going to be for what resource. So I'm going to select here, I want this for a SQL database, a SQL server, and then it's going to be this server. So if I had multiple database servers, Azure SQL database servers, they would all show up in this dropdown. So I'm going to select this. And then sub-resource, in this case, there is no sub-resource for SQL database server. Other Azure services may have sub-resources, such as a storage account. You can select if you want to create a private endpoint for blob storage or for file storage. So depending on the Azure service that you're creating the endpoint for, you may have sub-resources here that you need to select. In this case, it's just the SQL server that we're going to create this endpoint for. I'm going to click next. Where do we want to deploy this endpoint? So we're going to select the VNet that we created for this, Magna Data VNet, and the same subnet. We're going to leave everything else as default. Click next. No tags. Click next. And create the endpoint. So let's give it a couple of seconds for the endpoint to be deployed. And then we're going to go back and test the connectivity from the VM. If we go back to our diagram right here, we should be pretty much complete. At this point, we deployed the SQL database, the VM, the virtual network, and now number 4 was to create this private endpoint inside the virtual network, and that's what the VM is going to use to connect to the database. Should be finishing soon, and then we'll do a demo. One of the great things about grouping everything into a resource group, in this case I've been using this Magna Data RG, is that once I'm done with the demo today, I can quickly go into a resource group, delete the resource group, and everything gets deleted. So like you say, it's a way to group resources and manage resources as a group, even for permissions. So you can set up, say, for example, that I'm the owner of this resource group, and then automatically become the owner for any resource that is underneath the resource group. So it's a way to manage permissions, to manage the life cycle of your application. Okay, so this is complete. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to go and test this again. So let's go back. Actually, before I do that, let me show you now. Let's go into the virtual networks. Open Magna Data VNet. And then you'll see here in connected devices that we have, this is the VM that we created earlier. This is the IP address of the VM, and this is the endpoint. So a new interface gets created for that endpoint with its own private IP address, right? If we go into this diagram, I believe we're able to see this graphically. Yeah, so you can see this is the VNet, the subnet. We have 2 NICs. One is for the VM itself, and then the other one is for the endpoint. Okay, so let's go back into the VM. Let me hide this 1 second. This command prompt. So this is the IP that we had earlier. Let me open another one here so we can compare. And we're gonna do the same test. We're gonna do an NF lookup of the URL. Couple of things to notice. First, the URL didn't change. It's the same URL. So that doesn't change when you create a private endpoint. What this gives you is the ability to, let's say, for example, let me go back into my diagram. If for some reason you would like this resource to be also accessed externally and internally. In our case, we don't want this external access. We're gonna disable that. But if you wanted this to be also accessible externally, it's going to be the same URL. So you can use the same URL from inside the virtual network or from outside, from a public, from, let's say, from my computer that is not in Azure, and it's going to be the exact same URL. The difference is that when the URL resolves to an IP address, for me being external, it's going to give me a public IP address. And then, but for VMs that are on the same VNet, you're going to get resolved to a private IP address for that resource. Okay, so that's what we're seeing here. Since the VM is in the same VNet, we're getting the private IP address of the resource, but the URL did not change. It's the exact same URL. Okay, now I'm going to go and attempt to connect. And it worked. You guys noticed that I didn't have to make any changes in the portal at all. I didn't have to come here and go back into Azure SQL, into the server, and firewalls. So before, I had to come here and set this option to yes to be able to connect to that server. I didn't have to do that anymore because the connection is going to a private network, is connecting to a private IP. So you don't have to do this anymore. And that's the big advantage, as I was mentioning earlier, that security teams like private endpoints because of that, because it's a private IP. You're not exposing your service externally, and you don't have to open any firewall rules or anything within this service itself. It's all private connectivity between the VM and the database server. And that should conclude. So let me go back, summarize here really quick. What we deployed, we had the database deployed. Initially, it was externally accessible. Now that we have the endpoint created, it's not externally accessible anymore unless I come here and manually add the IP address of an external endpoint. So if I go back to the portal, if I wanted to, I can actually come here and deny public access to this resource. Say yes. So now public access is completely denied for this particular resource. I should still be able to connect. Let me just connect and connect here. Yep, it works. I can see the databases, I can see everything. But again, because I'm using the private endpoint. So I can disable public access and it's all now a PaaS resource where I don't have to manage any VMs, I don't have to manage any of that. But I have a private endpoint in my VNet, in my virtual network, that I can use to connect to the resource. It's not exposed publicly or through a public endpoint. That should be it. Any questions?
So no questions. If you have any questions, please send it through the chat and we will read it.
I wanted to leave around 15 minutes at the end for questions, but
we're going to post the recording on YouTube and we will let you know the link when it's ready. If you want to revisit.
Let me delete here the resource group really quick, so you can see one of the reasons for having a resource group, like I said, is to manage the application, the life cycle of the application. And if I go into the Magna Data RG that I created, you'll see that I have all the different resources that I've been deploying for this lab. The VMs, the network interfaces used for the VMs, the virtual network, all of these different resources. I don't have to manually go and delete each of this. I can quickly come here. Since I'm done with the lab, I'm done with everything. Or let's say, for example, you're done with a test you were doing for an application. You don't need that application anymore. You can come here, delete the resource group, type the name of the resource group, Magna data RG, confirm that you want to delete it, and then click on delete. I'm gonna wait if there's any questions. I'm not gonna delete it right now in case I need to. If there's any questions that you guys want me to go over in the portal.
This is very easy to implement, right? Very fast, and
very
anyone
easy.
can try it.
Yes. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is that even though we went through the portal and deployed all of this manually and going through the wizards, in a production environment, you may want to automate all of these steps. And we can have a completely separate conversation or a different session one of these days around ARM templates and around automation. But for testing purposes, this is fine. But for production, you may want to automate all of these steps, and you can deploy this with a single template in a matter of minutes. Thank you, Cecilia. Like I said, if you guys want to connect with me, you have my LinkedIn. Let me put it back in the screen. Happy to connect with anybody on LinkedIn. And if you have any other questions around Azure, just shoot me an email. We can definitely talk about it. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you for inviting me.
So thank you everyone for attending today, and thank you very much, Andres, for this.